Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
We take from the thousands of business books out there and test the author's ideas by comparing them to real-world challenges. With over 40 years of projects between us, we've got quite a bit to compare against. We give you the condensed takeaways, followed by our interview with the authors.
We know you want actions, not theories, and it's actions that we want to help shape, because that's what the Wicked Podcast is all about, helping you to become a wicked company.
I'm always the goofball that kind of starts these things. That's why I was kind of starting.
You're the funny one.
So, Marcus, guess what? We're at the end of our second season. We've done how many recordings now in total?
Yeah, we have about 20 now. Well, we've done more recordings live. We're currently at number 20. This is supposed to be 21 season. Yeah, we have different sizes of seasons. So let's just say we have a list of 20 live. By the end of the year, we're going to have nearly 30. So it's plenty of books to look at. But we thought it was time to go back and do a bit of a wrap-up again, or a review, or retro, however you call it, and have a look at about the recent books we've done and find some more actions for people in organizations.
You know, we did a really good wrap-up at the end of what we called our first season. And you're right, the number of episodes changes every time that we do one of these. So maybe it's not really a season wrap-up. But what I really liked about what we've been talking about is so many of these people, we're telling them really great ideas. They're reading the books. They find all of these things, and they don't know where to start. So what you and I kind of decided was we would do a little guide, and that's this guide. We're going to help you decide how do you start and where do you start to apply some of the great ideas in these books.
Exactly. And as our main promise goes, we want to show you actions. So here's a bit of a walkthrough, sort of a list of actions you can apply to any of the books or any of the items you find in the books that you find valuable, and go, how do I do that? How do I try that? So we want to give you a list, a bit of a checklist or steps and actions to take, and a little bit talk about how we would take some of the aspects of the books as examples, or what areas of your business you can apply those to, and sort of put that into a little 20-minute, 30-minute wrap up and insight. And
that's what this is going to be. I mean, and the other thing that I was thinking about is when you talk about compassionate business or the empathetic edge or seeing around corners, these are really big ideas. And I know some of the clients that I've worked with have said, we can't change our entire business on day one to be a compassionate business. And as much as I love to talk about moving to multi-stakeholder capitalism, which don't worry, Marcus, I'm not going to go into that again. The people don't know where to start. And one of the common themes, and I was talking about this in one of the earlier episodes, that keeps coming up is the concept of experiments.
Exactly. And the main reason why experiments are such a good thing is that they're very low risk, they're very small, they're very quick. And that's what you want as a business. You don't want to risk a lot. You want to have a quick evidence or proof of concept. And this is a big trend. And B, it's the most sustainable thing you can do when we consider something that we could call sustainable failure. You only want to fail a little bit and learn something to turn it into a value and say, hey, we learned something, this is what we can do, and here's some evidence for it. And then move ahead of it, either grow it or move on to the next experiment.
And that's the real important bit as well. This whole concept of failure, we keep coming back to businesses not understanding failure in the same way and being afraid of failing. And if you're afraid of failing, you're afraid of risking, you're afraid of trying different things. And so with an experiment, it turns out you're going to have a hypothesis, and the hypothesis will either be proven true or false. But in every case, the experiment actually succeeds because it was intended to either prove or disprove the hypothesis. We're trying to help you reframe these experiments and reframe what doesn't work, not as failure, but as an opportunity to learn.
And we also seen a lot in the work we do is that you can approach them from the top or the bottom. So either you're in a team and you want to experiment and run a little proof of concept that you have extra time for, or you want to just try something a little bit different. And you can do it from the top as a leader. You can say, you know what, we have a little bit of budget, we have a bit of time, or I'll grab myself 2 or 3 people and I'll do that with them and do an experiment. I'm not going to risk my job on this. I'm not going to risk a major budget on it or time restraint or time expense on it. I can do something and try something small. This is about small, quick, fail fast, learn something quick, get some value out of it, and actually test something that you wouldn't normally test. So this is what we're trying to do here.
The other thing I want to always point out to our customers and to our clients and to our listeners is experiments are not restricted to innovation. This is not something that only happens in the studio with the brightly colored beanbags by the crazy people. Experiments can be done by you in business anytime you want, at any aspect you want. I was talking to somebody just earlier today from L Marks, and they gave a really interesting suggestion. They said, as an experiment, why don't you move somebody from HR onto the trading floor for a big financial company and just see exactly what happens? That's a little experiment. And there was no cost involved, but probably really great opportunities for learning.
Yes, and another example from one of my projects recently, actually, that happened very early this year, just before COVID hit, was that we had sort of interns, not really interns, but placements. So people who are quite young, just come out of college, and they're going around different departments of the company. So the benefit there is, for example, to put little projects on them because A, they have a fresh new look at what you're doing. They're going to ask more likely the question like, why we're doing this like this, why we're doing this like that. And if you give them the right support, and you need to give them support because they won't know your organization as well as you do, is to make them therefore help them build a case. So let them observe something, test something, experiment something on a small scale within or outside of a project, and then let them feed back all the way to the board. Just help them build a business case, and it will look solid. The data will be valuable, and you'll have a very quick, simple, cheap, easy view on to prove something or to disprove something. And in this case in particular, we helped that young lady who was just brand new to this big organization. And the insights weren't really that different from having 5 or 10 senior people finding the same thing, spending more time on it. She was basically there and putting some of us to shame, to be honest, to go, yeah, I saw that. And it just took me a few weeks to have a look at it. I just asked a couple of people, I tested it, I tried it, we had a bit of a test run, and there you go. Amazing, valuable, and lots of insights, and just a small experiment that a lot of businesses can learn from. So this is all absolutely doable.
So now that we've kind of made the case for experimentation and given you a view as to how big or how small experimentation can be, we actually have a framework that we've worked through that we'd like to share with you that is a kind of a checklist to make sure as you're creating an experiment, you've got all the right pieces to ensure that the experiment succeeds at the objective, like I say, proving or disproving a hypothesis. Oh, by the way, neither Marcus nor myself have all of this totally memorized, so you're going to see us looking at our screens. And that's because we're trying to remember exactly what it is to make sure we give you the right things in the right order.
So in order to look at an experiment, there's essentially 5 steps you want to consider. The first one is the hypothesis part, where you describe the actual experiment and propose a particular outcome that you want to test. Second one is the baseline. It's a very important one, often overlooked, where you look at the current state of where you are in order to be able to measure how the experiment went afterwards properly. The third one is where you test and do the actual experiment, which should be very obvious in what that contains. And then number 4 is to assess the results of it and compare with the current state of what you've just achieved. And then last but not least, you'll have an assessment of the results, and you have a look if you're gonna reiterate on that or have found new problems or want to communicate and document it to leadership or the team or anywhere else of the organization that might be of relevance. Those are the simple 5 steps you can follow.
And, you know, we talk about experiments. It does have those 5 individual elements or steps that you're going to be going through. But the last time I did proper experiments, when I was like in a lab, was back when I was in uni. And so we're using some of the same kind of things, whether it's physics or whether it's chemistry, as far as the structure of running an experiment, starting with a hypothesis, with the proposed outcome, actually running the experiment, evaluating and assessing the results, and then deciding what are you going to do with that. Are you going to iterate and come up with a new experiment, or are you going to take this and move it up the leadership chain and do something bigger on a much bigger scale, hopefully at much lower risk because you've done the small experiments. So let's start with the hypothesis. Marcus, tell us about hypothesis and give us a couple of examples.
Yes, so as an hypothesis, you want to start with something that describes the various aspects of what you're trying to measure. The main part of that is often the outcome, what you're trying to achieve. So you're not talking about how you're going to get there, but basically what you're trying to achieve. So you want to describe the target space and case and what that entails. For example, if you want to increase the conversion rate of a sale, then you want to describe how much you want to raise that and how you're going to indicate and how you want to measure that potentially in the hypothesis, because that will set the scope of what you're trying to test and what you need in order to test it. And that could then set the scope for shaping a solution towards it and basically describing what the prototype or the experiment should be made of. So that would be your hypothesis.
My hypothesis on my website might be that we'd actually get more clicks on our podcast if we change the button from blue to red. We might actually get an increase of up to 20%. So the hypothesis is changing the button color will result in an outcome of an increase in clicks of 20%. So that's the hypothesis. So what's the next step?
So the next step we're taking then is the measurement, right? Just because you know what to measure doesn't mean necessarily you have all the functionality or tools or something in place. Sometimes it might be surveys and you have to see how you can approach the customers and how to get in contact with them, what the turnaround is. Sometimes is that you have a platform or a system that tracks certain things and doesn't track others. And even if it tracks it, does it track it live enough? Does it track granular enough? For example, we had some examples in projects where we had data that only came in once every 24 hours. And it wasn't quite enough in order, for example, to make a distinguishing differentiation between the morning, the midday, and the afternoon behavior of a customer. Those are the kind of things you might want to reevaluate and look at again and see if the measures you have in place are enough to give you enough insight, to measure enough, to really assess the outcome later. So measuring should always be reassessed depending what outcome you're going to. Because yet again, as I said earlier, if you look into something new, you might want to start measuring new things.
And so again, kind of pulling it back to the example of the red button versus the blue button. So whether that's connecting to your Google Analytics, and I've said that to some clients and they're like, We don't have access to our Google Analytics. And like, well, how in the world are you going to measure it if you don't have access to the underlying data? You're going to need to have access to the data. And whether that's customer reviews and NPS scores, or whether that's clicks, make sure you can indeed measure what you're going to be using as the basis for your hypothesis. Now, after I've got all this set up, I've got a hypothesis, I've got my baseline, I've got all of my systems in place to do the measurement. It's time for me to actually run the experiment. So Marcus, talk us through actually running the experiment.
So running the experiment should be pretty much the most obvious thing or the most familiar thing for you to do, because you build something or you build a mock-up or prototype or something and you'll execute it. There's more to be said about to what granularity or what kind of resolution you want to test things. Because sometimes you want to test just where the button sits. Sometimes you want to test, can people get from page A to page B? Sometimes you want to test if someone even reads a certain area on a page, or sometimes you have to get people through a couple of steps in order to really understand what part of the process succeeds or fails, or changes if you change certain things, right? So normally you're going to try to test something as small as possible, so you can build it as quickly as possible. And you want to focus the build or the prototype exactly on that moment that you're trying to observe. So again, there's a lot more, it's a bit of a dark arts to prototype and mock things up without having to fully build them. And that's another chapter to talk about at some point. For now, it's just focus on the area you're testing and make sure you have that in focus when you build and what part you build and what you need to get out of that. And that's your test. And then you run it. And then I think the only thing to potentially be flexible about is the fact that you might expect a certain amount of data to come back. If that amount of data doesn't come back straight away, then you might have to spend a couple of more days and collect more. Or it might be that you need to cap what's coming in and say, we're not going to put that out there for 2 million people. We're going to put it out to 500. That'd be good enough, right? So, but essentially testing, yeah, you build it, you test it, and then you wait till enough data comes back.
And then when you got the data back from the experiment, now it's time to actually run the analysis and actually to review the results. And you compare the actual results, the actual data from the change that you made, and you go back and compare it against the hypothesis. And was it true or was it not? We went on to the website, we changed the button color from red to blue, or was it blue to red? But whichever it was, we changed it. And then we waited a period of time. We then checked, did we actually get an increase of 20%? 20% more than what? 20% more than the baseline. If we only got 10%, then we didn't get the full expected change. So what we might do is try to either change the button color again, or we might iterate and say moving the button somewhere else on the page and come up with an entirely new experiment and come in with a new hypothesis at the top. Or we might repackage all of our great learnings, all of our hypothesis and information into a package and move it up the chain into the organization to roll out this change of red buttons across the entire website, because now we have data that we can actually use from experiments that we've actually run to justify why we'd want to change that button color. We've actually got the data, which means we are de-risking solutions, de-risking changes that we're requesting larger up in the organization. One of the things that we talk about a lot is doing experiments, but we're not the only people that are doing it. Amazon is doing thousands of experiments a month. Facebook's probably doing tens of thousands of experiments a day. That's right, a day. Both of these are big software companies running lots of experiments. But Marcus, what are the other clients that you're working with that actually are doing experiments and doing it well?
Well, I think the project we did over at BT was quite good because we definitely had variations that we were running on it, and BT started to really grow that quite quickly. So they've done really well in it. There are others that are, and I have to be honest, there are others where I won't name the names, but a lot of times the maturity of those can be quite low. The good part usually is this, and I think that's again where you a little bit point that out, that after you get the test results back and you look at and analyze it, there's often multiple options. Sometimes you can, in the best case scenario, you can go back to the leadership and say, right, look at what we just done. Give us more money for that because it's actually working, and it's working really well. At other times, and we've seen that, for example, at BT, which done it really well, we said, look, your hypotheses are totally wrong. This is actually not happening, and it's a misinvestment. But look what we found through the data. The data told us that there's this other thing. This is actually where the business opportunity is, and we need about X amount to save you Z amount. And that there resulted in millions of business benefits, which is great. And that's where you can pivot, right? So pivot is when you really suddenly see different areas through your research, when you disprove a hypothesis and you help the business correct the direction. And that's very valuable. The other part also that I've seen often is that when we go back to, let's say, the buttons, and as you just said, you might come back with a button and say, well, the green button did a bit better. But now that we tested the green button, we might want to test two other colors because seemingly there's an in-between here, or we had some feedback from people who said, oh, a green button is right, but it's still a bit too shrill or too loud or not big enough, so you want to try something again. Because in the end, what we're dealing with here, because we're dealing with wicked problems, is that we'll not ever end up with the perfect best solution, because we can only end up with something either better or worse, but never the best or the worst, right? So the black and white world is gone. The experimentation exists because things will change. Because the second you introduce, let's say, a better button, people start getting used to it. And there's sometimes the effect of, let's say, novelty, where for a while that's going to work. And after about a month, people look over it again, right? So there's those phenomena to take care of, which then really gets you into the whole iterative aspect and the reason for it, meaning that you want to check back if things are still working out and not changing. So, and that's one of the options after every experiment, that you iterate and you push it a bit further or a bit back, and just try more variants, because you want to day by day increment in getting better, not worse. And that's where experimentation plays a vital role.
And I really love the fact that you brought up within experimentation, you can not only learn whether or not a hypothesis is true or a hypothesis is false, but you can learn other things along the way. I mean, at the end of the day, 3M, the adhesive company, came up with Post-it notes because they made an adhesive that was absolutely crappy at actually sticking things. And that was how they kind of came up with the adhesive that's now used in Post-it notes. The other thing you were talking about with wicked problems change while they're being solved. And I'm going to completely screw up the science here, but I think that's like quantum particles. A quantum particle changes in the process of being observed. And sometimes your problems will change in the process of solving the problems. So as you're reading through all the great business books that we're reviewing here and talking to the authors on the Wicked podcast, and you're trying to decide, how do you start? How do you begin to make the kind of change that you need to make? Marcus, what do they need to do?
Yes, obviously you should experiment, because that's how you grow. That's how you try new things. That's how you increase your resilience to the ever-changing world. Every day a little bit. And it might sound scary at times that you tell someone, oh, every day something's going to change. But let me ask you this. What day isn't different? Every day is a bit different. Every day you look back at what happened yesterday and you're going to do something else, either better or worse or different. So we're doing it anyway.
The only constant in life is change.
Exactly. And I think, if we look at organizations as an artificial structure of avoiding change, then unfortunately they succeed a little bit too much. But if we look at our lives, especially if you have kids or something like that, your lives keep changing all the time. It's a never and or with your partner, it's a never ending process. This is how life is. So actually we're getting close to life if we accept that. And actually that should make us feel better. So when you start experimenting, and you can do that everywhere, we see so many areas in businesses are changing. You look at HR, look at, let's say, onboarding. Onboarding is one of those big areas that definitely needs disruption. Every project ever worked on had major issues around taking too long or trying this and trying that. And so we tried a few things. At BT, for example, we used a Trello board and we did a little onboarding process and experimented with it on a Trello board. Whenever we got new freelancers in, we had this and people could run through it. And it was an ever-growing effort because we put more bits and pieces in there, tested them, and then asked after we onboarded someone, how good was it? Do you now know what the project is about? Do you know what you have to do? And we took those answers to just keep iterating it. And we did this over a year. And after a year, we had a really solid, nice Trello board that was beating all the other onboarding mechanisms that they did or did not even have. Mm. So, HR is one thing. I don't know if you have another example of a project.
So another example of a client that I worked with many years ago was they were doing experimentation in an innovation setting, and they were looking to provide digital healthcare services for heart attack patients. And the number of things that we did that were incredibly small and incredibly impactful was great. We did prototypes just on pieces of paper and showed them various screens and a user journey to see, was this going to have the right kind of effect? So these were low cost, low fidelity, but they were great for results and great for feeding back into what was the actual product going to look like when it came to the end.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think the other thing is some of the most basic parts as well that can waste a lot of our times or create a lot of frustration with these meetings. In a lot of projects I went, normally teams would start to get more used to Agile or Agile at scale, or just generally introduce a lot of new types of meetings. And every time I think we went through the same process, and it's a process of experimentation. So it's quite fun to see it happening again and again, just as a sort of a learning process. As a standard is, first you add all these meetings, say, oh, we should have a stand-up, and then we should have a collective meeting at the end of the week just to see how everybody is. And then we should have a retro after the sprint, and then you have this and this and this. Before you know it, everyone has great ideas about those meetings. And then you run the meetings 2-3 times. And then very quickly it sets in that people go, do we need all these meetings? Just in meetings. Does everyone need to be there? So you start asking yourself, who needs to be there? You need a meeting? And so on. And I think especially with stand-ups, it's quite vital to experiment with them and actually admit that, maybe our stand-up is a little bit different. Maybe if someone doesn't have to say anything, they don't have to spend a minute or 5 on it to still state their status.
Right.
They just say, nothing new. Great, move on. Or ping nothing new on Slack and say, stand up, nothing new, and you don't even have to show up. You can do your work, right? Those are all aspects you should be able to play with and actually be allowed to test them and see if they make things better. And I think there's an interesting conversation I also saw at a small meetup where someone said, we have different teams that both sort of run Agile, but they're very type of different teams. Some are more customer facing and they need to, communicate a lot. The others are just hardcore coders. They're just into algorithms and that's what they do. They said, we don't need stand-ups. We just want to put our head down and work away. We actually do checkups every day between us to give each other hints and tips on how to solve an algorithm and doing that. So we're actually quite aware of our work, but we're using different meets and different check-ins at different times. We don't need a standard stand-up. The customer-facing ones, for those, it was perfect because it set them up for the rest of the day and gave them awareness of certain things. For the other team, it didn't work, and they used it at different times, at different level, or different types of engagement, and that worked perfect for them. So don't get too stuck with one particular process or with an experiment. Just say, right, it worked here. Can it work somewhere else? Again, you need to experiment again. You can't just say because it works here, it works everywhere else, which is what organizations like to say, and they like to force processes on people. And they never experiment with if it works with the same team. Every context is different, which is why we need variation and those experiments. And I think every team should experiment with whatever comes their way. So they should get used to it, and the organizations should be happy about it because it will make your teams more effective, more organic. And as Google's Project Aristotle said, if you have these soft skills in where everyone gets heard and everyone can have an opinion because everyone says, hey, I want to try something else. Hey, I think differently. That makes the best teams at Google. And statistically, that sounds like that can be true for other organizations.
I just remember what the other experimentation was that I was going to talk about. And it was experimentation that had to be done at speed. And that was experimenting, how do we do remote working? In the light of the pandemic, some organizations were better prepared to experiment and rapidly change and adapt, and some were not so prepared. And now people really understand that remote working is indeed something that's going to be going forward. But still, even now, 9 months in, they're experimenting because the edges are beginning to fray around remote working, the social cohesion, the opportunities for serendipity. And so people are still experimenting on how do we actually continue to have a vibrant company culture? How do we have those important water cooler connections and water cooler conversations that make the company hum and make it run? So I look forward to having more and more experimentation. And both Marcus and I hope that you also do more and more experimentation on your own projects, in your own companies, and hopefully using some of the ideas that you've heard here on the Wicked podcast.
Thank you for all of you out there to listen to that. It was a bit something different. I hope it was as valuable as our usual
Listened
podcast.
and watched.
Listened and watched. Hey, here comes the video star. So please feedback what you think. Let us know if you want to know more about that. Was that enough for you? Is that sort of the level of actions that might inspire you? Or was there something missing? Let us know, because we got plenty of knowledge. We got plenty of books. So if there's anything else we can help with, let us know. And like and comment as usual. You know the drill.
And one last closing thought. Guess what this is? This video podcast in a new format is an experiment. You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.